I used to think weeds were something you could fix just by pulling harder, spraying stronger, or finding the right trick. But year after year, I'd clear a bed, and a few weeks later, the weeds would start coming right back. I pulled them by hand, scraped the pathways, cleaned out the cracks, edged the beds, and stood back thinking I'd finally won. But after a rain or a few warm days, it all started over again. It took me way too long to realize the problem wasn't that I needed something stronger to kill weeds. The problem was I was dealing with weeds in the wrong order. I was always reacting to what I could see. But I wasn't dealing with what kept bringing the weeds back to the same spots: bare soil, gaps, bed edges, and those little areas where seeds always get a chance to restart. In this video, I'll show you when small tools actually help, when they don't, and why one-time weed control usually isn't enough. That completely changed how I handle weeds in my garden. And it all starts with one simple question: where are the weeds actually growing? See where the weeds are growing. Once I started asking that question, everything changed for me. Where are the weeds actually growing? It sounds simple, but for years I was skipping this step and treating every spot the same. Before, I'd see weeds and just want to deal with them right away. Later, I realized location matters more than the weed itself, because every part of the garden has a different level of risk. In the veggie beds, I'm not just protecting clean soil. I'm protecting roots, young plants, living soil, and seedlings that aren't strong enough to handle mistakes yet. I've gone too close to bed edges before, thinking weeds only mattered out in the walkways. A few days later, nearby seedlings started getting scorched edges, and that's when I realized even a few inches can make a big difference. In cracks or walkways, it's different. There's usually nothing growing right next to it, so I can treat it directly, as long as I control exactly where anything lands. So, before doing anything, I take a quick walk around the garden. I check where the weeds are, in beds, walkways, cracks, pots, or fence lines. It barely takes a minute, but it saves me from fixing mistakes for days later. When to use baking soda. The first group I separate out is the tiny weeds growing in cracks between pavers, along walkways, or near fence edges. These are places where there usually aren't vegetables or young plants crowded right beside them. So this is when I start thinking of baking soda as a spot treatment. I don't mix up a big sprayer for the whole garden. For a small area, I'll use about 1 quart of warm water, 2 tablespoons of baking soda, and a few drops of mild dish soap. For walkways, I use a bit more water. I stir it well so it dissolves as evenly as possible, then pour it into a small spray bottle. I only mix what I'll use that day. I don't like storing it and using it randomly later. When I apply it, I aim directly at the weed growing in cracks or walkways. I don't spray wide, I don't let it run everywhere, and I'm not trying to soak the whole surface. This is spot treatment, not garden-wide spraying. The reason is simple. Baking soda doesn't know the difference between a weed and a plant you want to keep. If it hits tender leaves or roots, it can affect those plants too. If a weed is growing right next to tomatoes, basil, or anything I care about, I just set the spray down. In those cases, pulling by hand or cutting it at the base is usually the safer option. Hand pulling and using a knife for weeds near plants. After handling small spots in cracks or walkways, I move back to the sensitive areas, weeds growing right next to vegetables, flowers, seedlings, or anything I want to keep. This is where I slow down and choose the least damaging method, not the fastest one. I usually do this when the soil is slightly damp, not dry and hard, and not soaking wet. Slightly moist soil lets weed roots come out easier, and nearby plants are less likely to get pulled up by accident. When I pull weeds near young plants, I hold the base of the crop with one hand. With the other, I pull the weed slowly straight up, no jerking, because one quick pull can disturb the whole root zone. If the weed is stubborn, I don't force it. I use a small knife or narrow weeding tool, work it down to the base, and cut or loosen it close to the soil line. I'd rather cut clean and come back later than tear up the nearby vegetable roots. I also avoid digging deeply around plants. A lot of weed seeds are just sitting in the soil waiting for light. If I disturb it too much, I clear the existing weeds today, but set up a new flush later. After pulling, I don't leave weeds on the bed if they've started flowering or forming seeds. I move them out and gently press the soil back around the plant so the roots settle again. Near crops, accuracy matters more than speed. A few extra seconds of careful pulling can prevent weeks of damage later. Cutting weeds at the base to weaken tough weeds. One mistake I kept repeating for years was trying to win against weeds in a single round. I'd pull harder and harder, expecting them to just disappear. What I eventually learned is that some weeds don't go away fast. They just need to be weakened over time. With these tougher weeds, I don't aim for a one-day fix anymore. Each time I come back, I just take a little more off, cutting leaves, trimming what I can, and not letting them fully recover their strength. My tools are simple: pruners, a small knife, or a flat weeding blade. The goal isn't to dig everything out, but to cut as low as possible without disturbing nearby plants. For deep taproot weeds, if the soil is too hard or the root breaks off, I don't keep digging. I cut it low, mark the spot in my mind, and come back when new growth appears. Sometimes I even stick a small marker near the spot so I don't lose track. It sounds simple, but it helps me stay consistent with stubborn weeds that always return in the same place. For spreading weeds with underground runners, I don't chase every root. I cut what's above ground and let the plant burn energy trying to recover. When new shoots appear, I deal with them early. If I wait too long, the plant rebuilds strength. If I catch it early, each cut slowly weakens it over time. I usually focus on the same areas: fence lines, bed edges, shed corners, or spots where weeds push through mulch. I don't turn it into a full garden battle, just targeted spots. Cover the soil right after weeding. After pulling or cutting weeds in an area, I don't just walk away anymore. I pause and look at the soil I just exposed, because that's exactly where new weeds love to start again. I used to think the job was done once the weeds were gone, but every time I left bare soil exposed, a few weeks later I'd see new sprouts coming right back in the same spots. Now I cover the soil as soon as I can after weeding. In veggie beds, I use straw, dry leaves, or dried grass clippings. In larger areas, I use mulch or clean cardboard under a top layer. When I spread it, I don't pile it tight against the plant stems. I leave a small gap so the plant base can breathe, then cover the open soil where weed seeds usually try to get started. With cardboard, I only use clean pieces, no tape, no glossy labels. I lay it down, wet it slightly so it stays in place, then add straw or mulch on top. I avoid using weeds that already formed seeds as mulch inside the bed. If they flowered or gone to seed, I remove them completely so I don't replant the problem I just cleaned up. Mulch doesn't need to make the garden look perfect. It just needs to cover enough soil so weed seeds can't easily get light, while also keeping moisture more stable. This changed how I think about weeding. Pulling weeds without covering the soil only fixes today's problem. Covering the soil starts dealing with the next wave, too. Weeding handles the present. Covering soil handles the future. And once I understood that, mulch stopped being a finishing step. It became part of weed control itself. Planting living ground cover. After using straw, leaves, or cardboard, I started thinking about another option in some parts of the garden: living ground cover. Instead of leaving soil open for weeds to return, I let low plants take that space first. I don't use this everywhere. In beds with young crops or plants that need a lot of water and nutrients, ground cover can compete too much. I mainly use it on edges, walkways, around perennials, or areas that stay empty for long periods. The idea is simple. Once the soil already has something covering it, weed seeds have a harder time finding light and open space. Weeds can still show up, but they're not starting from completely bare ground anymore. I choose low-growing plants that are easy to control and fit my garden. If a ground cover spreads too aggressively, it just replaces one problem with another. When I plant, I don't crowd the main crops. I leave space around stems, keep pathways clear, and trim back anything that starts creeping where it shouldn't. This works best after an area has already been cleaned up. Bare soil always invites weeds back. But if I fill that space with mulch or living cover, weeds have a much harder time restarting. Living ground cover doesn't replace pulling weeds or using mulch. It just fits into the same idea. Don't leave soil open for too long, because bare ground is where weeds always try to come back first. Before I get into the weekly checking habit, there's something I need to make clear. Not every plant growing where I didn't plant it needs to be removed right away. Some do need to be dealt with, but others just need a different way of being looked at. Dandelions are probably the most debated example. If they're growing in a young veggie bed or getting ready to spread seeds everywhere, I'll control them. But if a few flowers show up in a corner far from my crops, I don't rush to pull them immediately. Part of the reason is that a lot of gardeners see dandelions as an early food source for bees and beneficial insects at the start of the season. Some people even use the leaves, flowers, or roots as an edible plant. This also makes me more careful with stronger weed killers. I don't want weed control to turn into a blanket treatment across the whole garden. If someone is using chemical products, they should at least read the label closely, use proper protection, and understand the risks to crops, soil, insects, and themselves. When you look at weeds this way, the garden stops being a place where everything outside your plan gets destroyed. It becomes more selective. What is actually competing gets removed, and what is helping the soil, supporting insects, or not causing harm, can sometimes stay. For me, weed control isn't about turning the garden into a perfectly bare surface. It's about keeping the decision-making in my hands, which plants stay, which ones go, and handling each case based on observation instead of quick reaction. Don't wait until weeds get big to act. I used to only deal with weeds when things were already out of control. By then, they were tall, beds were messy, paths were overgrown, and everything took way more effort. Once weeds get big, everything becomes harder. More pulling, more digging, more time. That's what made weeding feel like an endless weekend job for me. Now I do it differently. Every week, I just take a few minutes to walk the garden, not to do a big job, but to catch small problems early. If I see tiny weeds in cracks or walkways, I deal with them immediately while they're still small. No heavy pulling, no long sessions, no deep roots yet. If I notice bare edges in beds or thinning mulch after rain, I fix it right away. Even a small handful of mulch at the right time can save me hours later. If I see open soil showing up between plants or ground cover, I cover it immediately. Sometimes it's just mulch. Sometimes I shift plants slightly so the soil isn't exposed. A small weed today takes seconds to remove. That same weed, left alone, can turn into weeks of work later. I don't fight weeds on weekends anymore. I spend a few minutes preventing them from becoming a fight at all. That's the real difference between reacting and managing the system. I used to always ask, what should I use to kill weeds faster? I was always looking for a stronger mix, a better trick, or something that would make weeds disappear instantly. Later I realized I was asking that question too early. Before choosing a tool, I needed to know where the weeds were growing, what I was trying to protect nearby, and whether that spot was going to invite weeds back again. Sometimes I use baking soda. Sometimes just a knife. Sometimes I come back and cut again. And sometimes the most important thing isn't killing weeds at all. It's covering the soil right after I clean it. And in some places, I don't leave soil open anymore. I use mulch, clean cardboard, or living ground cover to keep the soil covered so weeds don't get the first chance. The biggest change wasn't finding a stronger way to kill weeds. It was stopping weeds from deciding my whole workflow in the first place. Now I observe first, choose the right tool, work the right spot, and never leave bare soil sitting there waiting for the next wave. Weeds don't disappear forever, but they stop running the garden.